Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
I mean, how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, welcome back. It's the Karma Koala podcast, and the koalas are back at home. Well, not in Bondi. Not many koalas in Bondi, but anyway, back in sunny, freezing Sydney at this time of year, and we've got Lisa Varley on the show this episode. She is the CEO at My Dispensary and Entourage Effect. Lisa, welcome to the Karma Koala podcast. We're going to talk. We've given the sort of running title as the conversation, the dynamics of the Australian landscape. But first, maybe just a little bit of background about yourself and the work that you do for those two companies, organisations.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm flattered. I'm excited. It's great. So I'm the CEO of two companies. One is called My Dispensary, and we're a telehealth clinic, and we have a pharmacy on site, which will soon be open to the public. Our founder has a dream of helping people. Cannabis changed his life, so he wants to help other people as well. So a patient will be able to come and see the doctor and then walk outside and get their medicine dispensed, and it'll be a lot simpler than what we have to go through now.
In the old-fashioned way, proper old-fashioned GPs sort of approach.
That's exactly right. Well, with the traditional medicine, you see your doctor gives you a prescription. Now they can send you an e-script to your phone, and you go to the pharmacy, and the pharmacy 9 times out of 10 or 99% of the time will have your medicine. It's not that simple with cannabis, I'm afraid, because cannabis are unregistered products, and some pharmacies keep them, some pharmacies don't. And it's illegal to keep those medicines on site unless you actually have prescriptions for them. So the system's difficult to navigate because there's so many different authorities and so many different rules around Australia. Our other business, the Entourage Effect, we are a large wholesaler. We only wholesale S8 narcotics, and it's only cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
There's maybe 7 or 8 wholesalers in Australia. There's 2 big ones that have been around for a long time. There's Canvu and Montu. We would probably be considered number 3. We were a later entrant. However, our claim to fame is that we actually have nearly 90 brands. Most of the other wholesalers may have 40 or 50, but we have 90. Because before I worked in this job, I was the managing director of Beacon Medical, which is a cannabis company. And when I got this job, I thought, how do I beat everybody else and rise to the top? And the way to do that was to have more brands with me than anybody else.
And I presume most of those brands are from overseas. Is that right?
Yes, they are. We can't meet the demand in Australia with what we grow here. We've got some fabulous Aussie brands. We've got Tas Botanics based down in Tasmania. We've got UCS Botanics based in Tasmania. We've got ANTG up there in Byron Brae. They've got their own farm. We've got Simra Life Sciences. They have their own farm. They're the 4 main ones that come to mind straight away. But a lot of the flower that we sell in Australia is imported from all over the world. I remember when I first started in the industry, we mostly got flower from Canada, but now we're getting it from so many countries, it's not funny. We also have a large influx of flower from Thailand because Thailand decriminalised cannabis, then they changed their mind, and then they changed their mind again. So consequently, they've been growing a lot and they need to sell it. Unlike Australia, I think Thailand are quite clever. They won't buy anybody else's products, but they'll sell their own. Yep. Which I think is clever.
That's the ties for you. That's exactly.
Yeah, I think that's really good.
How they operate. And yes, I do think it is clever. And I also think it's, the way they're going, because they're going to create a sort of semi-Australian system in terms of people can access stuff. But I think they'll actually start developing some quite interesting medical, because there is a history of it in the country. So I do think I think Thailand really is a country to look at for the future. But anyway, that's another topic which we can discuss at another time.
Because I know a lot about that as well. Yeah,
no, definitely talk about that, because I'm really interested in Thailand. I think people don't pay it enough attention, and they concentrate on the day-to-day politics, which is the same everywhere. It's just the ties are relatively open as well compared to most countries in the world. So you actually hear about these things. But I mean, what we want to talk about in this episode is a title that you came up with, The Dynamics of the Australian Landscape. A lot of people think that I think from the outside, Australia has a really efficient medical cannabis system, and to some extent it does, but like anything, there's a lot more detail to that, and a lot more conversation within that model that I think most people outside Australia, and a lot of people inside Australia wouldn't be aware of. Maybe a really quick précis from your point of view of what you think Australia is at the moment, and then we can discuss the positives and the negatives after that. As a patient, and then compared to, essentially, there's a sort of de facto recreational, or I prefer to call it adult use market in Australia.
Yeah.
I think this is a major issue with Australia, is that there's the medical suppliers now control that market, and politicians, state and federal, don't really want to bite the bullet and work out a system that balances between medical and adult use. And I don't know what your views are on this, but for me, I don't think there's a proper system until that problem is solved. And as far as I can work out, that's been brushed under the carpet at the moment.
Look, I tend to agree with you. There's mass confusion. There's no doubt about that. Because the products are unregistered, getting a prescription is not that simple. So in the early days, all doctors would have to do an SASB application to the government, and it could take 1 to 2 weeks to get the approval back. Then the business grew quickly. So the market dynamics, it evolved that fast. It wasn't funny. So they needed a better system. So they came up with a system where doctors could do some study, they could get ethics committee approval, and they could become what's called an authorised prescriber. So once a doctor is an authorised prescriber, he can write prescriptions for patients. He doesn't have to do the submission to the TGA. That simplified things somewhat. There was still a lot of confusion. So the TGA decided to add in categories to make it simpler. So they made 5 categories. So category 1 is traditionally full CBD, CBD isolate, or maybe CBD with no more than 1 or 2% THC. Then category 2 was a bit more THC in it. Category 3 is balanced products. It's interesting to me, I talk to many people and they don't realise that a balanced product where you have equal amounts of THC and CBD completely mitigates the psychoactive effects, because for some illnesses and some treatments, THC is very worthwhile, but a lot of people don't like to get high. And then category 4 was the higher THC, and then category 5 was the highest. That became confounding as well, I think, because the government asked the suppliers to put their products in the categories, and some of the categories are actually incorrect. So that causes confusion. Now there are 10 different formats in each category. So in Australia, a doctor has 1 prescriber number and he has 1 provider number, but to write cannabis, he needs 50 numbers. Wow. And they're called MAPS numbers, and it's just silly. The other thing is there's been a crackdown because there's been a lot of potential overprescribing. So
I've heard, especially the New South Wales Department of Health are coming down like a ton of bricks, and almost there seems to be almost an element of cruelty in the way that they're dealing with some of the prescribing doctors.
They seem to get the good doctors, and the people doing the wrong thing seem to get off scot-free. Now, I've challenged the TGA about this a lot over the last couple of years, and every single time I've asked, I've been told that they only check on people who gets a complaint lodged against them. But there's a lot of passing the buck, because every single different state has different rules. New South Wales Health is different to Queensland Health, which is different to Vic Health. And you're absolutely right, New South Wales Health is having this big crackdown. Now, one of the doctors has been very vocal about it, and I actually agree with what she said. So if you've got a patient who wants more than 60 grams a month, it should be questionable. So if you need 90 grams a month, more than likely you've got a really serious chronic condition, or maybe you're palliative, or maybe you've got severe pain from cancer. So there are reasons and times when you could do that. Some patients are even on 120 grams a month. So what this doctor did, she worked with a lot of patients who had addiction problems, and she also liaised with addiction specialists. And you can't bring a patient on high doses. You can't just dump the dose right down and just leave them hanging like that. So she did the appropriate thing. If you want to prescribe outside the guidelines or you're concerned, despite being an authorised prescriber, you actually do an SASB application. So out of all the patients she's seen, she had 24 who were on higher than normal doses, And yet she had 24 approvals for SASB applications on top of her being an authorised prescriber. And yet when they were talking to her, they're asking personal questions about her and her life, which I do not think is relevant. I do not think that's fair. And yet we have clinics where you can speak to a doctor for 2 or 3 minutes and get absolutely anything that you want. So as you mentioned earlier, the rec market, I think a lot of the recreational patients are potentially self-medicating. I don't think they're potentially all just recreational patients. But if you look
I mean,
at the
that's
market,
the sense I get. Look, I mean, you know, I've got a 21, 22-year-old, and I can tell you a lot of them and their friends know how to balance between purchasing from the legal market and then the illegal market. They want to get hold of, they know they've worked out ways to get hold of their weed, basically. And
that's exactly
obviously
right.
if they can do it legally, because they're young, they feel a little bit safer. And I mean, I'm presume, you know, that's the same the whole way through the market, basically. Is so people have always smoked cannabis in Australia for a very long time. It's part of the culture. And but now there's more than one option in order to access it. And that's, you know, that seems to be the elephant in the room for me, is when is the industry per se going to be more open about accepting that, and because the only way government seems to change in Australia at the moment on this issue is they have to be forced by people, and it doesn't
That's right.
seem to be that, you know, this I get the sense from the outside that certain parts of the Australian medical cannabis industry would be quite happy for the status quo to remain, because it's not a monopoly, but it's quite close to, you know, complete market control, and that means you're just minting a lot of money. I mean, what are your views on that?
Well, there's a lot of problems. So I've been to many meetings with the TGA, and they keep insisting that these products need to be registered. Clinical trials take years. They cost tens of millions of dollars, and you can never do a clinical trial with flower. You will never get the identical terpene profile, the identical amount of CBD, THC.
Do they understand that? I mean, it's
They can't.
I mean,
They can't.
it's you can't do that with any plant.
But exactly. But also, I go to the Bondi Junction chiropractor, so I know that I can find a chiropractor in Bondi. How do I find a good medicinal cannabis doctor if I'm not allowed to talk to anybody? Yet people can get on Reddit and say whatever they want. And my biggest gripe, I say this to everybody. So the patient goes along to the doctor, and he's probably been using cannabis for years. So I really have problems sleeping. Have you got a nice product to help me sleep? Gets a fabulous product, high in myrcene, because the terpenes are actually the most important part of the plant and what makes it work. Goes home, sleeps like a baby. Then 2 weeks later, his mate says, oh, you wouldn't read about it. There's this great new flower out. You've got to try it. So he goes to the doctor, gets another prescription for the new flower, doesn't sleep a wink, and gets on Reddit and said, this is rubbish. That's ridiculous. Like, I'm sorry, that's not fair. Also,
yeah, it's again, it's the same conversation. Education, it's education, isn't it?
But we're not allowed to educate.
Yeah, I know.
You know, so 80% of all sales are flower, and the other 20%, 15% would be oil, and the other 5% is every other format. But I heard something fascinating today, and I was actually excited to hear it. Gummies or pastilles have become very popular only recently. They were hard to get, they were hard to manufacture, they're expensive, but doctors are actually embracing these with open arms, because doctors are into harm minimization. So if it's a good doctor who's really caring about his patients and he's trying to help the patients, they don't want patients vaping. They don't want them to touch a vape. They don't want them to smoke or do anything. And there's also the other fact that a lot of the people that use cannabis, they don't necessarily do it properly. If they're going to just roll a joint or put it in a bong, they're burning all the goodness out of it, because you need, you know, decarboxylation happens at a certain temperature, and it's different for each of the terpenes. So I know a lot of the recreational people actually like getting what they consider medicinal cannabis, because they get all the information about it. They get the COA, they can talk about the lineage, they can talk about the different terpenes. They actually get quite excited by that. So that's a good thing. It's just our biggest problem now is driving. So in 3 states, it's actually illegal to have 2 or 3 plants. I think Canberra, Tasmania, and Northern Territory. But then in Tasmania, you can only get your script from a doctor in Tasmania, and most of the doctors in Tasmania are against cannabis. And you can So I'm a patient. I'm a good example. I take very high dose CBD in the morning and I take very high dose THC at night to go to sleep. I put it in a capsule because I don't like the taste. Now, when I go to sleep, I'm woozy. I go to sleep. When I get up in the morning, there's nothing wrong with me. And yet I'm allowed to take a narcotic like Targan. I had a big operation a couple of years ago. And if I take 5 milligrams of Targan, I should not be let loose in public. So it's just, if you got picked up by the police and they found cannabis in your system, alcohol and narcotics, they'd go you for the cannabis, not for the narcotics or the alcohol. Yet I could drink a bottle of scotch and die. I could take a bottle of oxy and die. If I just took cannabis, I would just go to sleep. But doctors, some doctors are just so focused and they just will not listen.
A lot of the doctors' organizations in the States are very positive about cannabis now. Each week you see a new organization saying, obviously we have to do more research, but in the end, it's a positive development, and we need to, create legislation and regulate and work a way to create a system. Yet the Australian medical associations, and especially the main one, it's so conservative. It beggars belief. I mean, why is that the case in Australia, especially? And it's not just the US. I mean, in the UK, the various, they're positive. There is something that we can. This is positive for certain things, and we need to be more open and work out a way to create a system. What is it with the Australian medical sort of community that is so negative about this?
I personally think we're extremely backward. Anybody that rocks the boat or wants to do something a little bit different is frowned upon. I can name some very famous doctors like Charlie Teo. They won't even let him operate in Australia anymore. Another famous professor I used to work with, he was always treated as an outcast until he came up with the treatment for Clostridium difficile, and he invented fecal transplant. Then all of a sudden he was a hero. And it's the same with cannabis, I'm afraid. They're really outdated attitudes. A psychiatrist decided to write an article a couple of weeks ago bashing cannabis, saying how dangerous it was and that it should only be used for multiple sclerosis, MS-related spasticity. And there's another product approved for epilepsy in children. And then he goes, there's no data, there's no clinical trials, there's no nothing. That's actually not true. There's a real lot. And then he says, and it's pretty good too for CINV, which is chemo-induced nausea and vomiting. So he says in one breath, we've done clinical trials for 2 drugs. We've got no other evidence. But it's pretty good for CINV. Well, which one is it? Do we have clinical trials?
It's also that Australian thing which drives me crazy is unless an Australian has done a study, every other study on the planet is completely useless. And this always makes me laugh because obviously most of the research is done in the US at some of the biggest universities there, and it's been going on for 20 to 25 years.
Yeah.
Yet Australians have this sort of level of hubris that like any overseas study has no efficacy whatsoever until somebody has managed to get a grant out of a state or federal organization in Australia in order to sit around on our arse and write exactly the same thing or something very slightly different over a 24-month period. It's just crazy stuff. A lot of it seems to be about money.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I used to do medical education. So we have about 26,000 general practitioners in Australia, and we have the RACGP, which is the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, and they're the governing body and they have to prove continuing education. Now, I became an accredited provider of education. I worked with a doctor. I'm used to write the scientific program for these doctors to get their education points. And each state in Australia had one person who headed up the RACGP unit, and we'd have to do submissions of the courses that we were going to train the doctors with, and they'd approve them. And then each person in each state looked after a therapeutic area. So I'd send my 6 ALMs, like a course, to the lady in New South Wales, and she focused on gynecology. She'd send anything that was, say, oncology to the guy in Queensland, and, the guy in Melbourne did orthopedics, and the guy in WA did kidneys. He was like a urologist or something. And we submitted all the information, and she said, all of this, you're going to have to change it all. And I said, why? She said, you've got clinical papers that are more than 5 years old. I said, yes, I know that. She goes, it's outdated. It doesn't mean anything. And I said, no, I'm sorry, you're wrong. I said, there's drugs that were tested 20, 30 years ago with good clinical trials. They're great drugs. They're still in use today. We don't have the time or the money to keep testing these drugs to make sure that they're okay. The only reason that you'd retest a drug or do another clinical trial is you want to add another indication. So every drug, when it's registered, you have a primary endpoint and a secondary endpoint, you have an indication. And if you get your drug listed on the PBS, that means the government pays for most of the drug, and we only have to pay like $30 for the drug. So this woman used to be a school teacher. She had no background in medicine whatsoever, and she's approving my medical education for all the doctors in Australia. And she's telling me I can't cite a clinical paper more than 5 years old because it's irrelevant. She was actually irrelevant.
It's crazy, isn't it? Because it seems there's two sides of the coin. There's people trying to control a market and making lots of money, and then the people in administration who are tasked to manage it don't have the knowledge or education or history with the product to really have any understanding of it whatsoever. So I mean,
Yes.
I suppose the question is, what's the solution?
The solution is for industry to come together, which we're starting to do a lot better. There's a fabulous association called United in Compassion. It's headed up by a lady called Lucy Haslam. Her son had cancer and he was really, really ill and he was in excruciating pain. Her husband was a policeman and was really against cannabis. She wanted to do anything she could for her son. So she's like the godfather or the godmother of cannabis in Australia. So she runs this fabulous organization called United in Compassion. And then they also have the Australian Medicinal Cannabis Association. So there's some good bodies. People are starting to collaborate more. They're starting to get together. But the problem is we have to get this through to politicians, and politicians are not doctors, and they should not be making these decisions because they don't actually know what they're talking about. And that's a real concern.
And what about Australia has voted in various politicians into upper houses just on a cannabis ticket, which is the only place in the world it's really happened.
Yes.
Are they of any use at all?
They're trying to help, but we're not getting anywhere. Victoria's now looking at doing a trial for driving. So, when you get picked up for, drunk driving with alcohol, you're inebriated and they take a test. And if you're over the limit, you're probably dangerous. But as I said to you earlier, if a patient takes their medicine at night, they get up in the morning to go to work. There's absolutely nothing wrong with them.
This is an issue all over the world. The technology doesn't exist, and even if it did exist, every human being is different. So, but they're using an alcohol standard for trying to test cannabis, and until they think differently on that, it's going to be virtually impossible to work out how to manage people driving on cannabis.
Well, that's interesting you bring that up because I'm old enough to know in the olden days, if you got picked up for drunk driving, if you could walk a straight line, they let you go home.
Yeah.
Right. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Do you remember that? Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So they're saying the same with cannabis. There should be some test to see that you're incapacitated in any way. If you can speak properly and you're fine and you can walk the straight line or whatever, because just saying because you've got some in your system, there's something wrong with you, you shouldn't be driving.
And also, I know this is something I probably shouldn't say, but just because you've used some cannabis doesn't make you a worse driver. Sometimes it makes you a slightly more, especially in city traffic. My experiences of various cities is it actually makes you a better driver because you tend to be a bit more calmer about the way that you're dealing with the traffic. But God forbid you come in with those sorts of arguments.
Yeah, no, but okay, think about it like this. If an average person, not me because I'm too little, if an average person had 2 drinks, you would not be over the limit. However, if you had 2 drinks and you were taking narcotics or other barbiturates or other medications, that's really dangerous.
Yeah,
like
crazy
really dangerous.
Yeah.
And you would have a car accident and they test your blood and they say, oh, you're not over the limit, you're fine, it wasn't your fault. That's not right. It's just they've got this really, really bad attitude to cannabis. And it's really interesting because I used to work all over Asia and I worked in China, and in TCM, they've been using cannabis forever. And now they've cracked down in cannabis in China. You're not even allowed to put hemp in a cosmetic.
They've gone crazy in China recently.
Yes.
Because Hong Kong was developing a sort of CBD market and everything, and they closed that down within 24 hours when they decided to. What was it, late last year, I think?
Well, the first company I worked for in the cannabis industry, I worked for Kind Medical, and I worked for them for 6 months. And their mother company is Altum, and they had a brand in Hong Kong, and it was beautiful. They had all these fabulous products. They had a cafe, but like everything else, everybody started to copy what they were doing, and business was burgeoning. And then the police decided to crack down, and they caught some of the people, and they tested the products that they had, and they found minuscule traces of THC in it. So they shut the whole industry down, including even pure CBD.
I know. Well, I think China's shooting itself in the foot because it's going to find various Southeast Asian neighbors profiting very well from good quality cannabis in
Yes.
coming years. And but that's the way they think about everything at the moment. So again, that's another conversation. Do we have plans for improvements of the medical cannabis environment in Australia from both companies and government and administration in the upcoming 12 months? And if
Yes.
so, what are they?
Yes. So as I mentioned to you before, the organisation United in Compassion, they work with AMCA, or that's like the mother body, Australian Medicinal Cannabis Association. There's another group called MCIA, and there's another group called ETAA. They're thinking of merging, and they actually lobby with the government. They've spoken with a minister who's very pro-cannabis. So there are people that are supporting out there, but as I said, each state has a different attitude and a different position, and we can't get anybody to align. For instance, in Western Australia, you need 2 approvals to get your prescription. And as I said to you earlier, in Tasmania, you can only get it in Tasmania if a Tasmanian doctor wrote the script. It's bizarre. And it's interesting because I had a patient who was traveling around Australia, and he said, I'm going to be in Western Australia. What do I do? And I said, that's easy. If you're going to stay in a hotel for a couple of weeks, you have a telehealth appointment and you get your medicine posted to you because you get the e-script. So there's a lot of cannabis clinics in Australia. Some you get to see the doctor face-to-face, some are telehealth. And some of the clinics automatically post your medicine to you. Other clinics will give you a prescription. You can get the medicine from wherever you would like. To enter the industry is expensive and it's time-consuming. And the TGA don't make it difficult for anybody because they will not give timelines for anything. So it's expensive to buy 10 or 20 or 30 kilos of cannabis to bring it into Australia, because 10 kilos is what, 1,000 units, 50 kilos, 5,000 units. And by the time you've got to pay for that, you've got to get import permits, export permits, you need phytosanitary certificates. And the TGA will not give you guidance and they will not give you timelines on anything. They just say, we'll let you know. Even we're at a TGA meeting and they're starting to fine a lot of people. And we sat in the meeting and said, could you please give us examples so we get it right? And they said, no, sorry, we don't do it like that. You just have a go. If we don't like it, we'll let you know.
If you don't like it, we're just gonna chop you, basically.
Yes, my own boss was fined before I started working for him. He did everything that TGA suggested. He engaged the best solicitor in the country. The TGA then said, please get an external expert regulatory assistant to go over everything. We did everything. He did everything he was told. He still got fined $120,000. When he complained about it, they said, bad luck. We don't even have to tell you why we fined you. And they said, if you've got a problem, go get the money from the regulatory expert. So he did. He took legal action against the regulatory expert. He got his $120,000, but the legal action cost him $50,000. And as for having an external regulatory expert, there's no point, because they do exactly what I do. They ring the TGA, they sit on hold for 25 minutes and they get a part of an answer. Or you send an email and they tell you they'll get back to you soon.
It's just essentially the nub of the problem at the moment is that the legislators need to have a look at the TGA and
that's right.
And come down very hard on them and start making them make rules that people understand.
It's worse than that. They don't consult with industry. They just make these blanket rules without asking the people who actually know what they're talking about. So it's a real problem. They do not consult with the industry and they just come up with a new rule and everyone's like, as an example, one of the brands bought out what they call a pressurized inhaler. So it looks like a Ventolin puffer. So the doctors all had to go and get new maps because they weren't allowed to use the map for inhalation. They had to have one that said pressurized inhalation. What is the difference? I mean, seriously,